If you look at a photograph of a high-level corporate meeting from 1958, the first thing you notice isn't the suits or the hairstyles. It is the texture of the air. A visible, grainy gray haze hangs just below the ceiling fans and above the mahogany tables. In the late 1950s, smoking was not an activity. It was an environment. It was the background radiation of American adulthood. Roughly 45% of the adult population smoked. In some circles, military officers, journalists, surgeons, the number hovered closer to 80%. To be an adult in a professional setting was to be a person who carried fire in their pocket. What's strange, looking back, is not that everyone smoked. It's that the people with the most authority smoked the most. The spaces were designed for it. Office desks came with built-in ashtrays. Airplanes were equipped with small, flip-open metal receptacles in the armrests, even though you were hurtling through the air inside a pressurized tube filled with oxygen and fuel. Hospitals were perhaps the most telling. It was common to see a doctor in a white coat, a stethoscope around his neck, leaning against a nurse's station with a lit cigarette. It wasn't a sign of stress or a lapse in character. It was a sign of composure. In this era, the system didn't just tolerate the habit, it reined it, because the habit was woven into how authority functioned. Cigarettes were a social lubricant that bridged the gap between classes. The CEO smoked the same Luckies or Camels as the man on the assembly line. There was a democratic quality to the ritual. Television hosts like Edward R. Murrow were rarely seen without a plume of smoke curling around their heads. It gave them an air of intellectual density, a gravity that suggested they were thinking deeply about the Cold War or the Civil Rights Movement. The advertisements of the time reinforced this institutional protection. One famous campaign featured a man in a clinical headlamp and a white coat with the caption, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." This wasn't seen as a contradiction. To the 1950s mind, a doctor was an authority figure, and authority figures smoked. The cigarette was a tool for focus, a way to mark the passage of time, and a signal that you were a person with responsibilities and the right to consume. The first real tremor in this structure occurred on January 11th, 1964. The Surgeon General, Luther Terry, released a report titled Smoking and Health. It was a 387-page document that linked cigarette smoking specifically to lung cancer and chronic bronchitis. But systems are heavy. They have inertia. In the years immediately following the report, smoking rates didn't collapse. They barely moved. Information alone wasn't enough to dislodge a habit that still carried status. The data existed, but the norms were deeper than the numbers. Throughout the 1970s, the American landscape remained a smoking landscape. You could still smoke in movie theaters, in elevators, and in grocery stores. The government began to require small, understated warning labels on cigarette packs, but they were treated like the fine print on a lease, something you acknowledge exists but never actually read. What changed first wasn't the health of the smoker. It was the beginning of an economic realization. In 1971, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act banned cigarette advertisements on television and radio. This was the first time the system withdrew its most powerful protection, the cultural megaphone. Smoking began to lose its sophistication and started to become just a habit. Yet the institutional inertia was fueled by staggering amounts of capital. The tobacco industry was one of the largest taxpayers in the country. Big tobacco firms were blue-chip darlings of the stock market. For a long time, tax revenue and economic output acted as a shield. The system was willing to acknowledge the medical data as long as it didn't have to act on it. The economic incentives were still aligned with silence. The tension was palpable. The government was warning you that the product was lethal, while simultaneously relying on the tax revenue from its sale. The real transformation didn't happen because Americans suddenly cared more about health. It happened because the math changed. In the 1980s and 90s, the structure of the American workplace began to shift. The era of the company man with a guaranteed pension and lifetime health benefits, was fading. In its place came the rise of HMOs and employer-sponsored insurance plans that became increasingly sensitive to cost. Insurance companies began to read the actuarial tables with new severity. A smoker wasn't just a person with a habit. A smoker was a liability. A potential $200,000 lung cancer treatment. A $50,000 heart bypass waiting to happen. Risk, which had once been socialized, became individualized. This is when the price tag of smoking began to change. Taxes were no longer just a revenue tool. They became a behavioral lever. In 1980, the average price of a pack of cigarettes was around 63 cents. By the late 1990s, following the Master Settlement Agreement, prices began to climb sharply. The system stopped protecting the smoker and started taxing the risk. Smoking was reclassified as a negative externality. If you were going to smoke, the system decided you would pay for the burden you might one day place on the healthcare infrastructure. This was a quiet rewrite of the American contract. Risk was no longer shared. It was billed. The most unsettling way to observe this transformation is through physical space. Architecture and urban planning reveal our values more honestly than our rhetoric ever could. In the mid-20th century, the smoking section was the world. In the 1980s, the world was split in half. Restaurants began to ask, smoking or non? Usually, the smoking section was pushed to the back, separated by nothing but an invisible line and a struggling ventilation system. By the 2000s, smoking was confined to glass-walled airport rooms filled with thick, yellowed air. People stood inside, huddled together, like an exhibit in a museum of 20th century vices. Then the rooms disappeared. Smoking was pushed outside. Today, if you walk through a modern American city, you'll see the final stage of this marginalization. A small group standing at the edge of a parking lot, tucked into a concrete alcove near a loading dock. Ash collected in a heavy metal container, bolted to the ground. The body language has changed. In 1955, a smoker stood at the center of the room, chest out, an ashtray within reach. Today's smoker hunches, leans against brick, scrolls through a phone. They are physically removed from the clean space of professional life. In modern America, distance from the door is distance from power. The data today reveals a pattern no longer defined by age or gender, but by socioeconomic stability. In the 1950s, higher status meant higher smoking rates. Today, that relationship has inverted. According to the CDC, smoking rates are significantly higher among households earning under $35,000 a year than among those earning over $100,000. Smoking is now more prevalent among those with a GED than among those with graduate degrees. This isn't a medical coincidence. It's a reflection of who has access to alternatives. For high-earning professionals in wellness-obsessed corporate cultures, smoking is an expensive social suicide. Their status is tied to health capital, gym streaks, clean diets, optimization. The system protects their productivity by incentivizing their health. For those with fewer resources, the incentives are different. Smoking remains one of the few immediate, accessible ways to regulate a nervous system under chronic strain. A 5-minute cigarette break can be a small, controlled moment of autonomy. As taxes push the price of a pack to $15 in cities like New York, smoking becomes a regressive tax. Those least able to afford it are the ones most likely to pay it. The habit becomes a signal. It tells the world the system's incentives were never designed for you. What we're seeing is not the disappearance of smoking, but its reassignment. In the 1950s, smoking carried collective risk. We didn't know the full cost, and we shared the AIR. When the cost became clear, the system had to decide who would carry the weight. Over 50 years, that weight was shifted downward. In the 21st century, health itself became a status symbol. Smoking, once a sign of composure, became a sign of exclusion. The system no longer protected the smoker because the smoker no longer fit the model of maximum efficiency. Smoking was once a tool of the powerful. Now it is a coping mechanism for those with less power. As the sun sets over a modern office park, you can still see them, the glow of a cigarette at the edge of the property line. We like to believe the decline of smoking is a story of enlightenment, and biologically, it is. But the geography of the ashtray and the history of the insurance premium tell a different story. Our habits survive only as long as the systems that protect them. The smoke didn't disappear. It was moved outside. What changed wasn't the habit. It was who the system decided to protect from it.